London, August 23rd, 1305. The sky hung low over London, heavy with ash-colored clouds, as if mourning what was about to unfold. The streets of Smithfield were clogged with bodies, thousands pressed shoulder to shoulder, jostling for a glimpse, their breath rising in damp curls against the morning chill. Children sat on rooftops, old men leaned on canes. Everyone had come to see the end of a man who had defied a king. The wooden cart creaked forward, pulled by horses made nervous by the noise. Chained to the boards lay a figure naked, bloodied, barely breathing. His back was torn, his limbs streaked with bruises and mud. But his face was calm, his jaw clenched, his eyes, even through the filth, still burned with something terrifying conviction. William Wallace, rebel, outlaw, hero, traitor. It depended on whom you asked, but none could deny what he had become, a symbol too dangerous to let live. They had dragged him here over miles of stone and filth, paraded him through jeering towns. Now, before this sea of faces, he was to die, not swiftly, not with dignity, but by the cruelest ritual England could devise, designed to silence more than flesh. To unmake a legend? Yet even in chains, even at the edge of death, Wallace did not lower his gaze, and the crowd fell quiet. Before he became the scourge of England, before his name echoed across battlefields and into the nightmares of kings, William Wallace was a boy in the green hills of Renfrewshire. He was born around the year 1270, during a rare window of calm in Scotland's history, under the reign of King Alexander III. The kingdom enjoyed something close to stability. Borders were secure, trade flourished, and though storms of politics brewed in the distance, life for many Scots remained predictable, especially for a second son in a minor noble family. As Wallace was, his father, Sir Malcolm Wallace, held a modest estate, not rich, not poor, respectable in such a household. William's future might have been a quiet one, perhaps destined for the church or a role in some lord's retinue, but the world had other plans. Still, in those early years, he was allowed the luxuries of peace education, training, the chance to grow into a man before being asked to fight like one. He studied Latin with the clergy, gaining a fluency few warriors could claim. He read scripture, history, the dusty laws of Scotland. He learned swordplay and hunting, and how to track through forest and moor by his late teens. He had become a figure hard to ignore, tall, nearly 2 meters in height with broad shoulders, long limbs, and a strength that matched the quiet rage brewing inside him. But it wasn't just his body that stood out, it was his mind. William Wallace was not a brute. He saw the world through the lens of logic, strategy, and principle, in a time when most men followed orders out of fear or ambition. Wallace asked why, and that, more than his sword, made him dangerous. Mais bien. Then, in 1286, everything changed. King Alexander III, the last undisputed monarch of Scotland, rode out one stormy night to meet his new wife, somewhere along the coastal cliffs. He fell from his horse and died. He left behind no living sons, only a granddaughter, Margaret, known as the Maid of Norway. She was 3 years old, with the heir to the throne barely old enough to walk. Scotland entered a period of fragile uncertainty. Noble houses began to jostle for influence, old rivalries reignited, and while the crown technically had an heir, everyone knew the country needed more than a child to hold it together. Wallace, still a young man in his teens, watched from the margins, but he understood something vital when power is absent. Predators come, 4 years later. In 1290, the worst-case scenario arrived. Margaret died en route to Scotland, whether from illness or some unspoken hand of fate. She never set foot on Scottish soil. With her death, the line of succession vanished, and the throne stood empty. The realm spiraled into chaos. 13 claimants rose to compete for the crown. Lords turned on each other. Blood was spilled not in defense of the nation, but in hunger for its crown, and amid the growing disorder. The guardians of Scotland nobles tasked with temporary leadership did something desperate. They invited a foreign king to settle the matter. That king was Edward of England, known as Longshanks for his towering frame. Edward was not a man to miss an opportunity. He agreed to mediate, but with one chilling condition: all Scottish nobles must first acknowledge him as overlord. In their hunger for peace, they agreed. To Wallace, this was treachery quiet and cloaked in legal language, but treachery nonetheless. Scotland had not been conquered by sword, but surrendered with ink. Edward had laid his trap, and the Scottish lords had walked straight into it. In 1292, Edward crowned John Balliol as King of Scots on paper, a resolution to the crisis. But in reality, Balliol was little more than Edward's pawn, a man who ruled only so long as he obeyed orders from London. Wallace, watching from the shadows of his homeland, began to seethe. He saw the flags of England raised where Scottish banners once flew. He saw English sheriffs displacing Scottish law. He heard the whispers of soldiers taking food, land, and women with impunity. And he understood what too few around him dared to say aloud. Scotland was no longer free. And freedom real, hard-won, blood-earned freedom was not something that could be reclaimed through negotiations. It was something that had to be taken. In the years that followed, Wallace would move often. Some records suggest he traveled with his uncle, a priest, further honing his education. Others say he kept training with sword and bow, perfecting the art of silent movement through the glens and woods. He never joined the noble courts. He did not flatter kings or bow to lords. Instead, he waited watching as Edward tightened his grip, as Balliol buckled, and as resistance flickered and died in all but the boldest hearts. What remained of Wallace's youth was soon swept away entirely in 1296. John Balliol, desperate to assert independence, finally turned against Edward. He formed an alliance with France, England's longtime rival, and tried to reclaim his authority. Edward responded with fury. He invaded Scotland with overwhelming force. At Berwick-upon-Tweed, the first to fall, the massacre was unspeakable. 17,000 dead, men cut down in the streets, women and children slaughtered, churches burned. It was not a battle, it was an execution. Wallace, still a commoner in the eyes of the crown, had no army to command, no fortress to defend. But that day, something broke in him. The peace of his youth was over. The law was a lie. The nobles were cowards, and his country, his real country, was dying. And so, in silence and fury, William Wallace began to prepare for war. Edward IV of England was not a man who negotiated from weakness. He had fought in the Crusades, crushed the rebellious Welsh, and imposed order through fire and steel. Tall, ruthless, and brilliant, he believed himself chosen by God to impose unity on the British Isles, unity on his terms, through subjugation, not alliance. To him, Scotland was not a sovereign kingdom in crisis. It was a vassal state too foolish to recognize its place. And in 1292, when the Scottish nobles allowed him to select John Balliol as king, Edward saw the door fully opened. What began as arbitration became occupation. Edward demanded Balliol swear fealty as his vassal. He ordered Scottish nobles to attend his English courts. Overriding their own laws, he taxed the Scottish people, conscripted their men, and treated their king with thinly veiled contempt. Balliol, humiliated and powerless, became known among his own people as Tomb Tabard the Empty Coat. Tensions boiled. Whispers of rebellion spread in hushed tones across taverns and cloisters. But Edward moved faster than outrage could grow. In 1296, when Balliol attempted to break free aligning Scotland with France in the so-called Old Alliance, Edward reacted with overwhelming force. His invasion began not with warning, but with annihilation. Berwick-upon-Tweed was Scotland's largest trading town. On a spring day in March, the English arrived outside its gates. The townspeople, believing they could negotiate, offered a surrender of terms. Edward pretended to consider it. Then he ordered the gates stormed. What followed was not battle, but slaughter. English troops poured into the streets, cutting down everything in their path, merchants in their stalls, priests at their altars, women and children in their homes. For 2 days. The killing did not stop. Contemporary reports claimed 17,000 were butchered, though some say the number was lower. The horror was absolute. The massacre of Berwick was a message written in blood submission or death. From Berwick, Edward swept north. Dunbar fell. Roxburgh, Jedburgh, Edinburgh all yielded. Balliol was captured, stripped of his royal insignia, and publicly humiliated. His royal seal was destroyed, his coat of arms defaced. He was sent to the Tower of London, then exiled to France, Scotland, leaderless and broken, lay at Edward's feet. To consolidate his hold, Edward installed English sheriffs and judges across the land, garrisoned soldiers in towns and castles. He ordered every Scottish noble to swear fealty in a document known as the Ragman Roll, a long list of signatures, signed under duress, preserved to this day as a record of enforced obedience. But among the names absent from that roll was William Wallace. He was still a young man, unlanded, unrecognized in courtly circles, but the fire that Berwick lit in others had already turned to fury in him. Wallace saw the occupation not just as a foreign invasion, but a betrayal from within a collapse of Scotland's noble spine. The English presence in Scotland was not subtle. Soldiers took what they wished. Crops were seized for army stores. Women were harassed. Sometimes worse. Those who resisted vanished. Churches now answered to English bishops. Markets taxed Scottish merchants into ruin. The law no longer served justice, only Edward's crown. And still, the nobles said little. They bowed their heads. They prayed for time. They traded silence for safety. Wallace, however, had no patience for appeasement. He saw clearly what many refused to admit. Edward had no intention of ruling with fairness. His rule was conquest, not stewardship. It is unclear exactly when Wallace struck his first blow, whether it was an act of revenge for his father's death, or for the execution of his older brother. Some accounts say his beloved, Marion Braidfute, was assaulted or killed by English troops igniting a private war that became a national revolt. Historians debate the details. What is certain is this. In the town of Lanark, in 1297, William Wallace murdered an English sheriff named William Heselrigg. It was not a crime of passion. It was targeted, deliberate, and unmistakable in its intent. Wallace had made his choice. He would no longer live under the shadow of Edward's rule, and he would not die quietly. That act, a single blade in the dark, sparked a fire across the countryside. Wallace fled into the forests, pursued by soldiers. But instead of disappearing, he began to gather others, dispossessed farmers, runaway serfs, sons of murdered fathers. Together they formed a band of rebels, striking from the woods with guerrilla precision. These were not knights in shining armor. They wore no crests, swore to no lord, and carried weapons made from farming tools. But under Wallace's command, they fought like wolves. Small garrisons were overrun, supply lines ambushed. English messengers disappeared into the trees and never returned. Within months, Wallace's force had grown from a handful to hundreds, then thousands. He was no longer just a fugitive, he was a leader. And his rebellion wasn't just military, it was symbolic. He burned English tax records, publicly executed collaborating officials, declared the authority of Edward's law null in every place he took, in a land silenced by fear. Wallace's defiance was thunder in the dark. Word spread quickly in town squares. People whispered his name. In noble halls, it echoed with growing anxiety. In London, it became a thorn in Edward's side. This was not a war Edward expected. Scotland, he believed, had been pacified. But from the Highlands to the borders, a new resistance had begun to awaken, not led by kings or lords, but by common men who had seen too much and lost too many. And at the head of them stood William Wallace, tall and fierce, with fire in his chest and vengeance in his hand. In the spring of 1297, Scotland burned not from foreign fire alone, but from a rage born within. It no longer mattered whether William Wallace had lost a brother, a father, or a lover. What mattered was that he had become something no English army could easily kill a man with nothing left to lose, and no master but his conscience. What began in Lanark with the assassination of Sheriff Heselrigg spread with frightening speed. Within weeks, Wallace's name stirred fear in every English outpost south of the Firth of Forth. His war was not one of banners and castles, but of ambushes and swift retribution. His men struck without warning, melted into forest or fog, then struck again. This was not rebellion in the traditional sense. Wallace didn't ask for permission from noble houses, nor wait for decrees from fallen kings. He gathered the angry, the broken, the brave, and taught them to fight not as soldiers, but as survivors. His army swelled. Disenfranchised villagers, blacksmiths, even monks joined him. They brought axes and pitchforks, not lances. They had no uniforms, but their cause gave them form. Wallace taught them to strike the English where it hurt food convoys, isolated forts, supply depots. Their war cries echoed across the glens and moors ragged, desperate, alive. In May of that year, Wallace joined forces with William the Hardy, Lord of Douglas, and Andrew Moray in the north, though fighting on separate fronts. Their goals were aligned to push Edward's forces out of Scotland in time. Moray and Wallace's resistance began to unify, forming the heart of the national uprising. By late summer, Wallace was ready to face England's might head-on. On September 11, 1297, at the Battle of Stirling Bridge, Wallace's true brilliance as a tactician was revealed. The English, led by John de Warenne and Hugh de Cressingham, marched north with an army of over 15,000 men well-armed, well-trained, and confident. They believed Scotland already conquered. Wallace had perhaps 6,000 men, many poorly equipped. Yet he knew the land, and he understood how to turn strength into weakness. The narrow wooden bridge across the River Forth became his instrument, as the English attempted to cross in waves. Wallace waited. Only a fraction of their force could pass at a time, constrained by the narrow planks and thick marshland on both sides. When the front ranks were over and disorganized, Wallace gave the signal. Like a trap closing, his men surged forward. The English soldiers on the far bank were slaughtered before reinforcements could follow. Panicked troops turned back onto the bridge, which buckled under the weight. Men drowned in armor. Horses thrashed and fell. Cressingham, the hated English treasurer, was cut down and reportedly flayed, his skin turned into trophies by the Scots. It was not just a victory, it was humiliation. England's finest, broken by farmers and craftsmen. Stirling changed everything. The English retreated south. Scottish morale soared, and Wallace, once a nameless rebel, now stood as the living embodiment of resistance. Shortly after, he was knighted by whom remains uncertain and declared guardian of the Kingdom of Scotland in the name of the exiled John Balliol. It was a title of immense power and almost no security. Wallace, despite his newfound authority, faced more than just English armies. He faced Scotland's fractured nobility men who had sworn oaths to Edward out of fear, or who mistrusted Wallace's low-born origins and unorthodox methods. To many lords, he was a necessary devil courageous. Yes, but uncivilized. Too bold. Too unpredictable. But the common people, they worshipped him. He was the face of vengeance for Berwick, the voice for those silenced by taxes and swords. He spoke not of compromise, but of liberty, not of negotiation. but of justice, carved from the same stone England used to build its gallows. Emboldened by Stirling, Wallace launched raids into northern England. He burned towns in Northumberland and Cumberland, seizing supplies and returning hardship to those who had profited from Scotland's pain. These raids were not random. They were symbolic, a warning to Edward, and a message to Scotland: we are not weak, and we will not wait. But Wallace's greatest strength, his independence, was also his most dangerous flaw. He refused to play politics. He spurned noble etiquette. He did not flatter the court or seek alliances through marriage or gold. He demanded loyalty not to himself, but to Scotland, and in a world still ruled by bloodlines and family names. That made him an outsider among the ruling class. Worse still, he had provoked a king who never forgot an insult. Edward the Furness, upon hearing of Stirling and the northern raids, was enraged. His pride had been wounded before, but never like this. A commoner, a traitor, had humiliated his army, had dared to cross into England, torch villages, slay his knights. Edward swore revenge, and when Edward swore something, he followed through no matter the time, cost, or cruelty. By 1298, Wallace knew what was coming. England would not send another sheriff or treasury official. It would send its king and the full force of its empire. And still, Wallace prepared to meet him head-on. The tide had turned once before at Stirling Bridge, but tides turn again, and Edward, Warden of England, was a man who did not tolerate humiliation. After the defeat of his army in 1297, he did not delegate. He did not negotiate. He prepared. In the spring of 1298, Edward marched north with an army that dwarfed any Wallace had faced. Over 20,000 strong knights, footmen, siege engineers, and the dreaded Welsh longbowmen. This was no punitive expedition. It was a reckoning. Wallace, now guardian of Scotland, knew what was coming. But he also knew he could not hold cities. He lacked siege weapons. His men were farmers, not professional soldiers. And the Scottish nobles, still bitterly divided, offered little support. Many had returned to their estates after Stirling, satisfied with a single victory. Wallace had asked them to fight a war. They had only wanted a battle. Yet he stood firm. He gathered his forces near the town of Falkirk, choosing open ground a dangerous gamble. He deployed his men in schiltrons, dense circles of spearmen, bristling like hedgehogs. It was an innovation in infantry warfare, designed to counter the crushing power of English cavalry. Between the schiltrons were archers and light troops, backed by a small contingent of horsemen. It was brave, it was clever, but it wasn't enough. On July 22nd, Edward's army arrived. The battle began with a thunderous cavalry charge, English knights in full mail, banners flapping, lances lowered. Wallace's schiltrons held. Spears drove deep. Horses reared and fell. The English cavalry was repelled again and again. But then came the archers. The Welsh longbowmen, drawn from the rugged hills of Gwynedd, were among the finest in Europe. They advanced with terrifying discipline and loosed a storm of arrows that tore through Wallace's formations. The schiltrons, once so effective against swords and hooves, offered no defense against the sky. Men died in clusters, skewered where they stood. Panic spread. When the English cavalry attacked again, the shattered circles could no longer resist. The Scottish army collapsed. What followed was slaughter. Wallace escaped with his life, but his army lay in ruins. Thousands were dead. Falkirk was not just a military defeat, it was a spiritual one. The dream born at Stirling bled into the soil. In the aftermath, Wallace resigned his position as Guardian of Scotland. It was not a title he had ever craved, only a burden he had borne. Now it passed to Robert the Bruce and John Comyn, two nobles whose loyalty to the cause and to each other was tenuous at best. Wallace became a fugitive once more. Yet even in defeat, he refused to disappear. He slipped into the forests again, waging a slower, quieter war. He struck at convoys, ambushed garrisons, and remained a ghost in the English records for months. No one knew where he was, but in the hills of Scotland, the people still whispered his name, not as a hero who won, but as one who had not yet surrendered. By late 1299, rumors placed Wallace in France, sent by Scottish envoys to seek support from King Philip IV. Some say he carried letters of diplomacy. Others believe he came alone, desperate to find allies before Edward crushed what remained of his homeland. French records confirm he visited Paris, but offer little else. He may have traveled to Rome to petition the Pope, seeking recognition for Scotland's sovereignty. If so, his pleas fell on deaf ears. Europe was preoccupied. Wars between princes. Papal intrigue. No nation wished to antagonize England, whose ships controlled the Channel and whose coffers ran deep with conquest. Wallace returned home empty-handed. Meanwhile, Scotland fractured further. The nobles bickered. Robert the Bruce, though descended from royal blood, hesitated. Comyn jockeyed for influence. Some lords returned to Edward's fold, trading loyalty for lands. Others plotted in silence, waiting to see which way the wind would turn. Wallace, who had once united commoners and warriors through sheer force of will, found himself alone. To many in power, he was now an inconvenience, a living reminder of their cowardice. His presence was dangerous, his defiance contagious. Even those who had once fought beside him now saw him as a relic of a rebellion they no longer wished to pursue. In truth, Wallace was not broken by Falkirk. He was betrayed by time. The moment had passed. The fervor of resistance had cooled. And though Wallace still breathed, the cause he had carried on his back began to fade from the minds of men. But not from his. He continued to fight, though, now in shadows. With fewer allies and greater risk, he moved by night, trusted no one fully, and refused to yield even when the odds demanded it. His belief in Scotland's right to exist free, unruled, unbroken, remained absolute. It had cost him everything, and it would soon cost him more. In the early months of 1305, Wallace was still fighting. But others were watching, waiting, and among them were men with English gold in their pockets and betrayal on their tongues. By 1305, William Wallace was no longer a general. He was a shadow, a hunted man, a remnant of a dream Scotland itself seemed to be forgetting. In the years following Falkirk, the Scottish resistance fractured. The nobles who had once cheered his defiance now looked to their own interests. Robert the Bruce and John Comyn, once co-guardians, drifted further apart in ambition and trust. The fire that had united a people under Wallace's banner had dimmed, not extinguished, but buried beneath layers of fear, politics, and fatigue. Still, Wallace fought on. He avoided towns, slept in forests. His circle of loyal men had dwindled to a few. He relied on secrecy, on paths no maps recorded, and the quiet protection of common folk who still remembered what he had done, what he had dared. For these people, Wallace remained a legend made flesh not because he had won, but because he had never surrendered. But even legends bleed, even heroes grow tired, and the English knew it. Edward I had never forgiven Wallace for the humiliation at Stirling, nor for the raids into northern England. Wallace was not just a fugitive, he was a symbol. And symbols, if left alive, give birth to more rebellion. Edward wanted him gone, not simply dead destroyed. He issued orders throughout Scotland if Wallace was seen. Report him. If Wallace was helped, arrest them. If Wallace was captured, he would be made an example. But Wallace was no easy quarry. He moved with discipline, guarded by instinct, sharpened over years of war. He trusted few, spoke less. The English failed time and time again to catch him, until one of his own betrayed him. The man's name was Sir John de Menteith, a Scottish knight of noble blood, who had long since aligned himself with Edward's court. Whether Menteith acted from greed, ambition, or fear is unclear. What is clear is this: he knew where Wallace was hiding, and he told the English. In July of 1305, Wallace was invited to a meeting near Robroyston, not far from Glasgow. The message promised safety. The sender likely claimed to be a friend. Wallace went perhaps warily, perhaps out of desperation. What awaited him was not alliance, but ambush. He was seized in the night. Some accounts say he fought. Others say he was surrounded before he could draw a blade. Either way, he was taken alive, bound in chains, and handed over to English soldiers. From there, his final journey began. Dragged from village to village, town to town, Wallace was paraded through Scotland like a trophy. Crowds were forced to watch as he passed, some silent in horror, others jeering. Either out of fear or loyalty to Edward, he was kept in chains, exposed to the elements, taunted and beaten along the way. But even in chains, Wallace refused to be broken. He did not beg. He did not weep. He walked with his head high, eyes unflinching. The same gaze that had defied kings and terrified armies now met the stares of his captors with quiet contempt. Eventually, he was brought across the border through Carlisle, then south through the English heartland, all the way to London. The capital had not forgotten him. Word spread quickly. Crowds gathered, Londoners, fed on stories of the Scottish savage who dared defy the crown, came to see the rebel for themselves, to mock him, to celebrate his fall. Wallace was held in the Tower of London, the very symbol of royal power and punishment. But Edward had no intention of simply locking him away. No, this was to be theater, a warning in flesh and iron. On August 23rd, 1305, Wallace was brought before Westminster Hall, the same hall where England's laws were pronounced, where monarchs held court. There, he stood accused of treason. Treason, a word that echoed through the vaulted chamber with bitter irony. Wallace answered the charge with clarity. I could not be a traitor to Edward, for I was never his subject. To the English court, it was defiance. To history, it was truth. He was denied a defense. The verdict had been decided long before the trial began. The sentence was death, not by sword or gallows, but by the most brutal method the crown reserved for traitors to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. It was a punishment meant to erase the man from memory. Edward wanted Wallace's death to be more than execution. He wanted it to be erasure, a ritual of agony so complete, so monstrous, that none would ever dare speak his name again. In the days that followed, the people of London prepared for a spectacle. Vendors set up stalls. Priests stood ready to offer last rites. Children clambered onto walls. The capital transformed into a theater of cruelty. And Wallace, the man who once led an army, was cast as the condemned. But even now, in the face of death, he would not kneel. And for that, Edward would make sure his end was unforgettable. August 23rd, 1305, London. From first light, the crowds began to gather. Smithfield was thick with people merchants, beggars, nobles, children hoisted on shoulders, mothers clutching hands. They had come not just to witness an execution, but to revel in it. This was not justice. It was theater, a spectacle of power. At the center of it all was William Wallace. He was dragged through the cobbled streets tied to a wooden hurdle. Face down, his body scraped raw by stone and gravel. For miles, he had been pulled by horses from the Tower of London to the site of his death, a parade of humiliation. His limbs were bruised, his back flayed, his hair matted with dirt and dried blood. Yet as he passed, those who dared look closely saw something terrifying in his eyes. He was not broken. Wallace, the rebel, the outlaw, the warrior of Stirling, had been captured, But he had not surrendered. His body belonged to his captors. His soul, never. Edward the Wise had not spared cruelty in his judgment. The sentence was to be carried out in full, and publicly a warning engraved into the minds of all who watched. This is the price of defiance. The first stage was hanging. Wallace was hoisted by the neck from a wooden gallows, his body twisting in the air. But the rope was cut before death could come. He gasped, choking, eyes bulging, throat torn by the strain. The purpose was not execution, it was suffering. Next came the drawing. While still alive and conscious, Wallace was tied down. His abdomen was sliced open. Slowly, methodically. His intestines were pulled from his body and held before his face. Some say they were burned while he still breathed. Others say he bit his lip until it bled, refusing to cry out. Whether in agony or in silence, he endured more than most men could imagine. Then, castration. His manhood was cut away not for military necessity, but as a final insult, a symbolic erasure of his lineage and legacy. It was meant to reduce him, to humiliate him before the people. But the faces in the crowd, once jeering, began to change. Some looked away. Others wept. Even among the English, something had shifted. The final blow was beheading. Wallace's head was severed from his body with an axe. In that moment, the physical suffering ended, but his punishment did not. His corpse was butchered, quartered, each limb cut from his torso. These parts were sent to 4 corners of the kingdom Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth, reminders nailed high on gates and towers. His head, preserved in tar, was mounted on a spike atop London Bridge. It remained there for months, a grim totem, a warning, a boast. But it did not achieve what Edward intended. He had meant to erase a man instead. He enshrined a martyr. The brutality of Wallace's execution reverberated through Scotland. Word traveled fast by merchant, by soldier, by whisper. The details were burned into memory. The rope, the blade, the fire, the silence. But more powerful than the horror was the aftermath. Wallace's death did not extinguish resistance. It ignited it. In the years that followed, his name was spoken with reverence in cottages and castles alike. Mothers told their sons of his courage. Priests offered prayers in his memory. And one man, Robert the Bruce, who had once hesitated, now stepped forward. Bruce had once knelt to Edward. Now he rose. In 1306, less than a year after Wallace's execution, he declared himself King of Scots. It was not an easy ascent. He was excommunicated, defeated, hunted. But he persisted, and in 1314, at the Battle of Bannockburn, his army crushed the English in one of the most decisive victories in Scottish history. It was the beginning of true independence. In 1320, the Declaration of Arbroath was signed, a formal letter to the Pope, asserting Scotland's sovereignty. In its words echoed the spirit of Wallace. It is not for glory, nor riches, nor honors that we fight, but for freedom, for that alone, which no honest man gives up but with his life. The declaration was not a tribute to a king, it was a tribute to an idea born in blood, carried on the backs of rebels, and consecrated on the scaffold where William Wallace drew his last breath. 7 centuries later, his story is still told, not as a relic of the past, but as a mirror held to power, to patriotism, to pain. Wallace wasn't perfect. He was fierce, unbending, and at times ruthless. But he believed in something larger than himself, in a Scotland free to live by its own laws, to speak in its own tongue, to rise and fall by its own hands. And for that, he paid the ultimate price. But he did not die in vain. He died as only a true patriot can, not quietly, not conveniently, but defiantly. And in doing so, he gave his country something no conqueror could ever destroy, a reason to remember. They tried to make an example of him, to turn flesh into warning, pain into silence. But instead, they gave him permanence. William Wallace was not buried in hallowed ground. His body was scattered to the winds, his head blackened by tar above the Thames, his limbs nailed to gates like hunting trophies. There was no grave for mourners to kneel before, no tomb to honor, only memory. And yet that was enough. His execution was meant to end him, to crush not only the man, but the spirit he carried. But the truth of Wallace's life is not found in how he died. It is in what his death revealed that courage is not the absence of fear, but the refusal to bend beneath it. That freedom, real, painful. Human freedom is not granted by kings. It is claimed by those who dare to defy them. In the centuries that followed, Scotland would see victories and betrayals, triumph and loss. Flags would change, thrones would fall, but the name Wallace would remain etched into stone, whispered in classrooms, carved into monuments, not by royal decree, but by the will of a people who remembered. Because history does not remember the comfortable, it remembers the uncompromising. He died in agony, but not in vain. He died for an idea that could not be hanged, drawn, or quartered. And in the stillness after the crowd had gone, after the blood had dried and the echoes had faded, one truth remained quiet, steady, unshaken. You can kill a man, but you cannot kill what he stood for.